My husband laughed as he called me a burden in front of his friends, turning me into the punchline of the evening. The room filled with smirks, and no one came to my defense. I stayed calm and said nothing. An hour later, one unexpected revelation changed the atmosphere completely. Suddenly, nobody would meet my eyes, and my husband looked terrified. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who underestimated your worth. My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. Tonight was supposed to be a monumental celebration of my husband Marcus and his tech startup. We were hosting an extravagant dinner party in our upscale Atlanta home, a sprawling modern property with floor-to-ceiling windows and an infinity pool that Marcus loved to show off. The dining room was illuminated by modern crystal chandeliers, reflecting off gold-rimmed plates and imported crystal glasses. 10 of Marcus' closest friends and business associates sat around our custom mahogany table. They were a mix of software developers, local influencers, and self-proclaimed venture capitalists, all dressed in expensive tailored suits and designer cocktail dresses. They represented the elite circle of young, successful African-American professionals that Marcus desperately wanted to lead. I stood quietly near the head of the table, collecting empty appetizer plates, while the ambient sound of smooth jazz played softly in the background. Marcus stood up, tapping his silver fork against his champagne flute. The loud chatter in the room instantly died down as everyone turned their attention to the man of the hour. Marcus flashed his signature, charismatic smile. It was the same charming, confident smile that had drawn me to him when we first met at a college mixer years ago. He smoothed the lapels of his custom velvet jacket and raised his glass of vintage champagne high in the air. To the future, he declared, his voice booming across the dining room with practiced theatricality. If Vanguard Holdings does not drop that $5 million investment tonight, I swear I will break my back carrying this household forever. He paused, letting the words hang in the air for dramatic effect. Then he looked directly at me. His smile turned into a condescending smirk. After all, someone has to pay the bills while my lovely wife plays around with her little freelance graphic design hobby. She is my adorable financial burden, but I carry her because that is what good men do. A man has to be the provider even when his wife brings home pennies. The entire table erupted in laughter. 10 pairs of eyes shifted toward me, glittering with amusement and poorly disguised pity. His brother Jamal chuckled loudly, slapping the mahogany table. Jamal sat next to his white wife Chloe, who offered me a patronizing smile while sipping her champagne. "Oh, Maya, you are so lucky. Marcus is so patient," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Most men would demand their wives get a real corporate job. You really hit the jackpot with him." I did not flinch. I did not drop the heavy stack of imported porcelain plates in my hands. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I simply offered a polite practice smile and continued clearing the remains of the Alaskan king crab legs. The irony of his grand speech was almost too delicious to interrupt. Marcus stood there playing the role of the wealthy, powerful provider, completely oblivious to the fact that his personal bank accounts were running on fumes. Just 4 hours earlier, I had stood next to him at the exclusive wine boutique downtown. He had wanted the absolute best vintage champagne to impress his friends tonight. I watched him hand the cashier his premium platinum credit card with a smug look on his face. The machine beeped an angry red tone. Declined. He had snatched the card back, sweating profusely through his expensive, tailored shirt, muttering something about a bank error and frozen funds. He tried a second card, and the machine declined it again. The cashier looked at him with polite pity while Marcus scrambled for an excuse. I had smoothly stepped in and handed the cashier my own plain black debit card. I brushed it off lightly, telling Marcus I would cover it, using some spare change from my recent graphic design gigs. He had eagerly accepted my help, too relieved to question how a freelance designer could drop $2,000 on champagne without batting an eye. That spare change had paid for the entire evening. The massive Alaskan king crab, the imported caviar, the floral arrangements, and the private catering staff currently preparing the main course in the kitchen. Every single luxury displayed in this room was funded by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. He loved the illusion of power, but he had absolutely no idea where the real power in this room resided. For 5 years, I had let Marcus believe he was the sole breadwinner. When his first 3 business ventures failed, I quietly paid the mortgage and told him he just needed more time. I designed his pitch decks, I proofread his business plans, and I managed the household finances so he could focus on his dreams. He believed my graphic design business brought in just enough to cover my own coffee habits. In reality, my design work was merely a front. Over the past decade, I had quietly built an empire. What started as a small digital investment portfolio had grown into a massive private equity firm. I was the founder and sole chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, an anonymous venture capital firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars. I worked through layers of legal protection and trusted proxies, ensuring my identity remained a closely guarded secret in the financial world. I bought this Atlanta mansion under a corporate shell company. I paid for Marcus' cars. I funded the very life he was currently bragging about. Marcus drained his glass of champagne and slammed it back onto the table. "Maya, you need to hurry up and clear this mess," he ordered, pointing a demanding finger at the remaining appetizer plates. "The legal representative from Vanguard Holdings is arriving in exactly 1 hour to sign the final investment paperwork. I need everything spotless in the living room. I do not want any of your clutter ruining my big moment. You know how important these venture capitalists are. They do not hand out $5 million to people who live in messy houses." I carefully stacked the last plate, holding his gaze for a second longer than usual. The complete disrespect in his voice was the final confirmation I needed. I had spent months debating whether to fund his current tech startup through my firm. I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to see him succeed. But tonight, watching him demean me to elevate his own fragile ego shattered any remaining illusion I had about our marriage. He did not love me. He loved the comfort and the financial punching bag I provided. I smiled warmly and nodded, twisting my diamond wedding ring around my finger. "Of course, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly even and calm. "I will make sure everything is exactly as it should be for the Vanguard representative. I will clear the table and prepare the living room so you can have the exact meeting you deserve." I turned and walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. As the dining room erupted into loud cheers for Marcus and his impending millions, I allowed myself a genuine, bright smile. Marcus was absolutely right about one thing. Vanguard Holdings was a massive, incredibly powerful venture capital firm that did not hand out $5 million easily. What he did not know was that the representative arriving in 1 hour was not bringing a check. The representative was my personal corporate lawyer, bringing a portfolio of financial fraud evidence and a set of divorce papers. And he was going to deliver a message my husband would never ever forget. The heavy swinging door of the kitchen closed behind me, muffling the roar of laughter from the dining room. I walked over to the massive white marble island and set down the stack of imported porcelain plates. The kitchen was a sanctuary of stainless steel and pristine surfaces, a sharp contrast to the toxic atmosphere I had just left behind. I turned on the faucet, letting the warm water wash over my hands. I did not shed a single tear. I did not let my hands shake. I simply breathed in the quiet air and focused on the undeniable truth that my husband was a fraud. Before I could even reach for a towel, the kitchen door swung open again. Chloe marched into the room, bringing with her the overpowering scent of a heavy floral perfume. She was Jamal's wife, a woman who had spent the last 3 years treating me like a charity case, simply because I chose to work quietly from home, while she paraded around spending money she did not actually have. Chloe casually shrugged off her designer ivory cashmere coat and tossed it carelessly onto one of the custom velvet bar stools. She did not even glance at me as she walked over to the commercial refrigerator to pour herself another glass of sparkling water. "You know, Maya, I really have to hand it to you," Chloe said, taking a slow sip from her glass. Her voice carried that familiar aristocratic drawl she always used when she wanted to remind me of my place. "You handle these dinners so well." I would be absolutely mortified if Jamal announced to a room full of our wealthy friends that I was a financial burden, but I suppose you are used to it by now. I picked up a linen towel and slowly dried my hands. I did not rise to the bait. Instead, I offered her a polite, tight smile. Marcus has a very specific sense of humor, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. He loves to entertain his audience. Chloe let out a soft, condescending laugh and leaned against the marble counter, crossing her arms. She looked around my immaculate kitchen with an evaluating gaze, as if she were inspecting a property she intended to purchase. "Well, you really should be grateful he is so generous," she said, tilting her head. Most men in his position, men who are building massive tech empires, would demand a wife who brings something substantial to the table. A corporate executive or a lawyer, perhaps. But Marcus, he has such a big heart. He took you out of that cramped little apartment and gave you this beautiful life. You get to stay home and play around with your little freelance graphic design hobby while he carries the real weight of the world. You truly hit the jackpot, Maya. I neatly folded the linen towel and placed it on the counter. The sheer audacity of her words would have enraged me a year ago. Now they just amused me. Chloe had absolutely no idea that the very marble counter she was leaning against was paid for in cash by my holding company. She did not know that the luxury SUV she drove here tonight was leased under a corporate account that I personally approved. She lived in a fantasy world funded by my silence. "I am very aware of everything Marcus does for this family," I said smoothly. "We have a very unique partnership." Chloe smiled, looking thoroughly satisfied with herself. She loved feeling superior, and tonight she clearly wanted to twist the knife. "Speaking of partnerships, I have some incredible news," she announced, holding up her left hand to admire her own reflection in her wedding band. "Jamal and I are finally moving out of our condo. We just closed on a magnificent 6-bedroom estate in the most exclusive gated community in Alpharetta. It has a private wine cellar, a tennis court, and a guest house. It is a massive step up for us." "That sounds like a beautiful property, Chloe," I said, genuinely leaning against the sink. "Moving into a luxury estate is quite a milestone." "It really is," she beamed, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. Of course, the bank needed a very strong guarantor for a property of that magnitude. Jamal makes a good living, but the underwriters wanted extra security for the jumbo loan. Marcus was an absolute angel. He co-signed the mortgage for us without a second thought. He said family always takes care of family. I guess you would not know much about the credit requirements for a multi-million-dollar estate, but having a powerful man back your investments makes all the difference. I felt a sharp, cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. I knew exactly which estate she was talking about. I also knew exactly which bank had issued that loan, because Vanguard Holdings had recently acquired a controlling stake in their parent company. I had reviewed the high-risk loan portfolios just last Tuesday. Marcus had indeed co-signed their mortgage using his startup as collateral, a startup that was completely broke. "Congratulations to you and Jamal," I said, lowering my voice to a calm, calculated register. "A jumbo loan in this volatile market is quite the aggressive commitment." "Tell me, Chloe, did you lock in a fixed rate, or are you riding that adjustable rate mortgage everyone in the financial sector is warning against?" Chloe frowned, her smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. She blinked at me clearly, not expecting a freelance graphic designer to ask about the specific underwriting terms of her luxury real estate purchase. I let the silence stretch between us, watching the gears turn in her head. "Jamal handles all the financial details," she finally said, waving her hand dismissively. "We are perfectly fine. We have a great rate." "That is a relief," I replied, taking a step toward her. "Because I read the market reports this morning. With Marcus co-signing, you must be highly exposed. If you are on an adjustable rate and the market shifts next quarter, your monthly payments will double overnight. Since Marcus used his unvalued company shares as collateral, a default would trigger a margin call. The bank would immediately seize the estate and liquidate your assets. Are you and Jamal prepared for that kind of catastrophic liquidity drain?" Chloe stood up straight, dropping her arms to her sides. The fake sweetness completely vanished from her face, replaced by a defensive, angry glare. Her cheeks flushed a deep shade of red. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Maya, she snapped, stepping toward me. You sit at home drawing logos for pennies. You do not understand high-level finance or real estate investments. Jamal and Marcus are businessmen. They know exactly what they are doing. You should really stick to washing the dishes and leave the adult conversations to the people who actually contribute to society. She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest, ready to launch into another tirade about my social standing. She opened her mouth to put me back in my place, but before she could utter another toxic word, the kitchen door swung wide open. Sierra walked into the room. She was Marcus' closest female friend, a woman who had always hovered around our marriage like a shadow. Sierra was dressed in a sleek, backless emerald gown that clung tightly to her curves. She carried an empty wineglass and wore a perfectly practiced, innocent smile. But my eyes did not focus on her dress or her smile. My eyes instantly locked onto her neck. Resting against her collarbone, catching the bright kitchen lights, was a stunning diamond tennis necklace. The stones were flawless, cut in a very specific cascading pattern that ended in a brilliant pear-shaped drop. The air in the kitchen suddenly grew incredibly thin. I stopped breathing. I knew that necklace. I knew the exact carat weight. I knew the exact clarity. I knew the name of the boutique jeweler in Paris who crafted it. I knew all of this because just 3 days ago I had reviewed the joint credit card statement that Marcus thought I never checked. I had seen the charge for $32,000. When I had casually asked Marcus about the massive international charge, he had looked me right in the eyes and sworn he had purchased custom server equipment for his new tech platform. He had kissed my forehead and thanked me for keeping the company afloat. I stared at the diamonds glittering around Sierra's neck. The final puzzle piece clicked into place, completing a picture of betrayal so deep it almost took my breath away. He had not just called me a burden. He had used my money, the money I quietly transferred to our joint accounts, to buy luxury jewelry for his mistress. Sierra noticed me staring, and her hand instinctively flew up to touch the diamonds. "Oh, Maya," she said, her voice thick with fake sympathy. "Marcus sent me in here to see what was taking you so long. He really needs you to hurry up and clean this mess. You do not want to ruin his big night, do you?" The sharp, elegant chime of our front doorbell echoed through the expansive house. The noise in the dining room instantly cut off. I could hear Marcus clapping his hands together. "He is here," Marcus practically shouted, his voice pitching up with giddy desperation. "The Vanguard representative is here. Everyone look sharp. Jamal, hide those empty glasses." Chloe sit up straight. I walked out of the kitchen and stood quietly in the archway connecting the dining room to the grand foyer. Marcus was sprinting toward the massive double front doors, smoothing his hair and adjusting his cuffs. He took a deep breath, plastering his most charismatic, confident business smile across his face. He reached out and swung the heavy wooden doors open wide, ready to welcome the man who was going to hand him $5 million. But it was not my corporate lawyer standing on the front porch. It was not a representative from Vanguard Holdings. Standing under the warm glow of the porch lights, looking incredibly stern and deeply unwelcome, were my in-laws, Pastor Thomas Jackson and his wife Beatrice. Pastor Thomas wore his usual dark tailored suit, clutching a worn leather-bound Bible tightly against his chest. His posture was rigid, projecting the intimidating authority he used every Sunday to command his megachurch congregation. Beside him, Beatrice stood wrapped in an expensive fur shawl, clutching a thick manila envelope in her hands. Her expression was sour, her lips pursed together as she peered past Marcus into the brightly lit house. They had not been invited to this dinner party. They hated my presence in their family, and they only showed up when they wanted something entirely unreasonable. Marcus' smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping outside and trying to pull the doors partially shut behind him to block their view of his friends. "You cannot be here right now. I am expecting the most important investor of my life. We are here because the Lord guided us to secure this family future," Pastor Thomas announced, his booming voice easily carrying into the foyer. "We are here to handle family business before you sign any corporate documents." Beatrice pushed past her son, stepping directly into the foyer without taking off her shoes. She completely ignored the 10 guests staring at her from the dining room. Her sharp, judgmental eyes scanned the space before locking onto me standing in the kitchen archway. "We are not leaving," Beatrice declared, tapping her manicured fingernail against the thick manila envelope. "We are staying right here until your wife signs this post-nuptial agreement. Because when God blesses you with $5 million tonight, we are making absolutely certain that this woman does not get her hands on a single penny of our family legacy." Beatrice marched across the foyer, the heels of her expensive boots clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile. She did not bother to greet her son's friends. She did not offer a polite wave to Chloe or Jamal. She walked straight up to me and thrust the manila envelope against my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the floor. "Open it!" Beatrice commanded, her voice echoing loudly enough for every single person in the dining room to hear. "It is a legally binding post-nuptial agreement. My lawyers drafted it this afternoon. It states that any wealth Marcus acquires during the course of this marriage, including his startup capital, and any future business valuations belong solely to him and the Jackson Family Trust. You will waive all rights to alimony, all rights to spousal support, and all rights to any equity in his technology company." I looked down at the thick stack of paper in my hands. The audacity of this family never ceased to amaze me. They paraded their religious piety around Atlanta like a badge of honor, yet their greed was the most unholy thing I had ever witnessed. "Mom, please not now," Marcus pleaded, rushing back into the house and grabbing his mother's arm. "You are embarrassing me in front of my guests. Vanguard is going to be here any second. This is not the time to deal with Maya." "It is exactly the time," Pastor Thomas declared, stepping inside and closing the heavy front doors. He adjusted his tie and offered a stiff nod to the dining room guests, who were watching the scene with rapt attention. "A man must be a good steward of the blessings the Lord provides, Marcus. You are about to enter a new tax bracket, a new echelon of society. You cannot carry dead wood to the mountaintop. Your wife has contributed nothing to your vision. She sits at home designing silly little pictures while you sweat and bleed to build an empire. The Bible says a man reaps what he sows, and Maya has sown nothing here." I slowly opened the envelope and pulled out the legal document. I flipped through the pages, scanning the ridiculous clauses Beatrice had paid some cut-rate lawyer to draft. They wanted me to waive my rights to the very company I was secretly funding. They wanted to ensure I walked away with nothing, while Marcus walked away with millions. It was a masterclass in financial abuse dressed up as parental protection. "Sign it!" Maya Beatrice demanded, pulling a gold pen from her designer purse and holding it out to me. "Sign it right now. Do not try to pretend you do not understand it. You know exactly what this is. You thought you could ride my son's coattails to a life of luxury. You thought you could just sit back and reap the rewards of his brilliance. Well, the ride is over. You will sign this document, or Thomas and I will make sure Marcus freezes every joint account you have access to by tomorrow morning." I looked at Marcus. He was staring at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked embarrassed, but he did not defend me. He did not tell his parents to leave. He just rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long, stressed sigh. "Just sign it, Maya," he muttered, his voice low and defeated. "Just sign the damn paper so they will leave and we can get back to the dinner. It is just a formality anyway. You know I will always make sure you have enough for your groceries and your little design supplies. Just do it so I can focus on my investor." Sierra let out a soft, mocking laugh from her seat at the dining table. Chloe whispered something to Jamal, and they both shook their heads, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. I was the helpless wife backed into a corner by her powerful, wealthy in-laws. I was the pathetic freelancer about to be legally stripped of any protection. That was the narrative they had all accepted. That was the reality they believed. I took the gold pen from Beatrice's hand. I clicked the top, feeling the smooth, heavy metal between my fingers. I looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the post-nuptial agreement. Beatrice smiled, a cruel, victorious expression that crinkled the corners of her heavily Botoxed eyes. "That is a good girl," she mocked. "Know your place. You were never meant for this kind of wealth anyway. The Lord protects his chosen." I held the pen over the paper. I did not feel angry. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. I was standing in a house I owned, surrounded by people who despised me, holding a contract that was completely legally worthless, because the man they thought was a tech genius was actually deeply in debt to me. Before the tip of the pen could touch the paper, the front doorbell chimed again. This time, it was not a polite single ring. It was a firm, authoritative series of chimes, accompanied by heavy, rapid knocking on the solid wood. Marcus jumped, nearly knocking over a decorative vase on the entryway table. "Oh God, they are here," he panicked, spinning around wildly. "Mom, Dad, get out of the foyer. Maya, go to the kitchen. Take that paperwork with you. Go, move." Beatrice crossed her arms, stubbornly holding her ground. "We are staying right here until she signs," she insisted. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice dropping an octave, cutting through the chaos with absolute icy precision. Marcus did not have time to argue. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. He practically shoved his father out of the way to reach the door. He yanked it open, plastering that desperate, charming smile back onto his face. "Welcome to the Jackson residence," he greeted, bowing his head slightly. "I have been expecting you. Please come in. We have a wonderful evening prepared." Marcus stepped back, extending his arm to welcome the savior of his failing company. He expected a single venture capital associate carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a friendly smile. Instead, 3 massive black armored SUVs were parked aggressively in the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. 3 men stepped onto the porch. They were not smiling. They were not dressed for a celebratory dinner party. They wore dark tailored suits, tactical earpieces, and the distinct, unmistakable aura of high-level corporate security. The man in the center, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and a briefcase chained to his wrist, stepped into the foyer. He did not extend his hand to Marcus. He did not return the greeting. His cold, calculating eyes swept over the room, taking in the confused guests, the angry in-laws, and the extravagant displays of wealth. Marcus swallowed hard, his smile faltering. "I am sorry," he stammered, taking a half step back. "I was expecting the investment representative from Vanguard Holdings. Are you with the legal team?" The silver-haired man ignored Marcus completely. He walked right past my husband, right past Pastor Thomas and Beatrice, and stopped directly in front of me. The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen. The man unclipped the briefcase from his wrist and set it on the entryway table. Then he took a step back and bowed deeply, bending at the waist in a display of absolute, unwavering respect. "Good evening, Madam Chief Executive," he said, his voice clear and professional, carrying easily across the silent room. "The hostile takeover documents are fully prepared. The forensic accounting audit is complete. We are ready to execute the corporate seizure at your command." I clicked the gold pen closed and handed it back to Beatrice. Her mouth was hanging open, her eyes wide with shock. I let the blank, unassigned post-nuptial agreement flutter from my hands, scattering across the Italian tile floor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wire-rimmed glasses, sliding them onto my face. I stood up straight, letting the posture of a quiet, submissive wife fall away, instantly replaced by the commanding presence of a woman who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars. "Excellent," I replied, my voice ringing with authority. "Let us get to work." The sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through the kitchen, cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. Marcus immediately stopped talking to Sierra. His eyes widened with frantic excitement, and he smoothed the front of his tailored velvet jacket. "They are early," he gasped, his voice pitching up with giddy desperation. "The Vanguard representative is here." He sprinted out of the kitchen, leaving Sierra and me behind. I stood perfectly still, holding the bread knife. I listened to his rapid footsteps crossing the hardwood floor of the grand foyer. I heard the heavy wooden front doors swing open, followed by Marcus offering his most charismatic, booming greeting. But his enthusiastic welcome died instantly in his throat. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" Marcus hissed. His voice was no longer confident, but strained and panicked. "You cannot be here right now. I am expecting the most important investor of my life." I wiped my hands on a linen towel and walked slowly from the kitchen into the archway connecting to the foyer. Standing under the warm glow of the porch lights, looking incredibly stern and deeply unwelcome, were my in-laws, Pastor Thomas Jackson and his wife, Beatrice. Beatrice pushed right past her son, stepping directly into the foyer without wiping her expensive leather boots. She was wrapped in a lavish mink shawl that reeked of heavy designer perfume. Her sharp, judgmental eyes scanned the room, taking in the catering staff and the expensive floral arrangements before locking onto me. She did not offer a greeting. She did not even acknowledge the guests in the dining room who had paused their conversations to watch the spectacle. Pastor Thomas followed closely behind his wife. He wore his usual dark, tailored suit, clutching a thick, worn leather Bible tightly against his chest. His posture was rigid, projecting the intimidating authority he used every Sunday to command his megachurch congregation. "We are here because the Lord guided us to secure this family future," Pastor Thomas announced, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We are here to handle family business before you sign any corporate documents." Marcus frantically tried to pull the door shut behind them to block their view of his friends. "Mom, please," he begged, grabbing his mother by the arm. "You are embarrassing me. Vanguard is going to be here any second. This is not the time to deal with Maya." "It is exactly the time," Beatrice declared, shaking off his hand. She marched across the foyer, the heels of her boots clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile. She walked straight up to me and thrust her hand into her oversized designer handbag. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and slapped it down hard onto the entry table right in front of me. "Open it," Beatrice commanded. Her voice was loud, intentionally raised so that every single person in the adjacent dining room, including Chloe and Sierra, could hear exactly what she was saying. I looked down at the thick stack of paper slipping halfway out of the envelope. Printed in bold black letters across the top page were the words, "Post-nuptial agreement." Beatrice crossed her arms over her mink shawl, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "My lawyers drafted it this afternoon," she explained, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "It states that any wealth Marcus acquires during the course of this marriage, including his startup capital and any future business valuations, belong solely to him and the Jackson Family Trust. You will officially waive all rights to alimony, all rights to spousal support, and all rights to any equity in his technology company." I kept my face entirely blank. I did not gasp. I did not act shocked. The sheer audacity of this family never ceased to amaze me. They paraded their religious piety around Atlanta like a badge of honor, yet their greed was the most unholy thing I had ever witnessed. "Sign it right now," Beatrice demanded, pulling a heavy gold pen from her purse and shoving it toward me. "Do not try to pretend you do not understand it. You thought you could ride my son to a life of luxury. You thought you could just sit back and reap the rewards of his brilliance while you doodle your little freelance graphics. The ride is over, Maya. When Marcus gets that $5 million check tonight, we are making absolutely certain that a freelancer like you does not get her hands on a single penny of our family legacy." Marcus paced back and forth, rubbing the back of his neck in a panic. He was sweating, completely terrified that his potential investors would walk in and see this chaotic scene. He did not care that his mother was publicly humiliating his wife. He only cared about his image. "Dad, tell her to put this away," Marcus pleaded, turning to his father. "I need to focus on the pitch." Pastor Thomas stepped forward, holding his Bible tight. He looked down his nose at me, using the exact same preachy, gaslighting tone he used to manipulate his congregation. He twisted his faith to justify their toxic greed. "A virtuous woman knows her place," Maya, the pastor, began, his voice rich with condescension. "A good wife steps back into the shadows so her husband can let his light guide the family. Do not let greed cloud your spirit. Marcus is doing the Lord work tonight. He is stepping into a new echelon of wealth and society. You must release any earthly claim to his blessings. Sign the paper, Maya. Prove you are a dutiful, submissive wife. Do not be a stumbling block to my son's destiny." I looked at the hypocritical pastor. This was the same man who preached charity on Sunday mornings while secretly using church donation funds to lease luxury vehicles for his private use. The toxic nature of this family was entirely masked by their religious reputation. Chloe and Sierra had moved to the edge of the dining room, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute delight. Chloe offered a smug little nod, clearly thrilled to see the black woman she constantly talked down to finally being put in her place. Sierra sipped her wine, resting her hand right over the $32,000 diamond necklace my money had paid for. Maya just signed the damn paper, Marcus hissed, grabbing my shoulder and giving it a hard shake. Just sign it so they will leave and we can get back to the dinner. It is just a legal formality anyway. You know I will always make sure you have enough money for your groceries and your little design supplies. Just do it so I can focus on my investor. You are embarrassing me by stalling. I looked into my husband's eyes. I saw the pure cowardice hiding behind his tailored suit. He was willing to strip me of every legal protection just to appease his overbearing mother and get his hands on a check. He truly believed I was nothing but a fragile, dependent woman backed into a corner by his powerful family. I reached out and took the heavy gold pen from Beatrice. Beatrice smiled, a cruel, victorious expression that crinkled the corners of her heavily powdered face. That is a good girl, she mocked. Know your place. You were never meant for this kind of wealth anyway. I held the pen over the signature line of the post-nuptial agreement. I did not feel angry. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. I was standing in a house I owned, surrounded by people who despised me, holding a contract that was completely legally worthless. Marcus was trying to protect a company that was drowning in debt. And they were trying to block me from receiving a $5 million investment from a venture capital firm that I personally controlled. I tightened my grip on the gold pen, preparing to make my final move. Right as the tip of the pen hovered over the dotted line, the doorbell rang again. It was a heavy, resonant sound that made Marcus jump. Outside the large glass front doors, the glaring bright beams of headlights suddenly cut through the darkness of our front lawn. It was not a single car arriving for a business meeting. The heavy rumble of massive engines vibrated through the floorboards. 3 large black bulletproof SUVs slid aggressively into our circular driveway, completely blocking the entrance to the house. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed through the thick front glass. 2 men stepped out of the lead SUV. They were dressed in immaculate tailored black suits, moving with synchronized military precision. One held a thick titanium-locked briefcase. They did not look like standard venture capital associates arriving for a celebratory dinner. They looked like corporate executioners stepping onto a battlefield. I watched them approach the front steps. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. I did not shed a single tear for the death of my marriage or the vile disrespect being hurled at me. While Marcus scrambled in a sudden frantic panic, I smoothly slid my phone from my pocket. I opened a text thread saved simply under the name lawyer. I typed a single word: proceed. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Absolute total control. Marcus spun around his face, a mask of frantic desperation. He pointed a shaking, demanding finger at me. Get out of the way, Maya, he hissed, his voice sharp and venomous. Take that postnuptial agreement into the kitchen, sign it, and stay entirely out of sight. The real adults are doing business now. Do not ruin the most important night of my life with your pathetic lingering. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, blocking my path and using his massive physical presence to intimidate me. He lowered his voice, adopting that heavy, commanding, preachy tone he used from the pulpit to subjugate his congregation. A good wife must know when to step back into the shadows so her husband can truly shine, Maya. He lectured, glaring down at me. You have held him back long enough. Retreat to the kitchen. Let Marcus step into his God-given glory. Beatrice nodded in smug agreement, pulling her expensive fur shawl tighter around her shoulders. Listen to the pastor, she sneered. You have overstayed your welcome in the main house. Go hide in the back where you belong. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I took a deliberate step backward, melting into the shadows of the archway, but I did not leave. I stood perfectly still, watching the magnificent disaster unfold. Marcus threw the double doors open wide. The crisp night air swept into the foyer, but it did not chill his arrogant warmth. Gentlemen, he boomed, his voice artificially deep and coated in fake charisma. Welcome to the Jackson residence. I have been eagerly anticipating your arrival. Please come in. The two men stepped across the threshold. The lead lawyer, a tall man with striking silver hair and cold gray eyes, did not take Marcus' outstretched hand. He simply stepped past him into the grand foyer, his gaze sweeping the room with calculating precision. Marcus, oblivious to the icy reception, clapped his hands together and turned to his audience. The guests in the dining room were watching in silent awe. Chloe and Jamal leaned forward, eager to witness the sealing of a $5 million deal. Sierra stood near the dining table, her hand resting provocatively on her diamond necklace, smirking at my silent presence in the background. Marcus decided this was his ultimate moment to cement his status as the undisputed alpha of his social circle. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a nearby catering tray and raised it high. "See this, everyone," Marcus announced, gesturing grandly toward the two silent lawyers. "This is what happens when you know exactly how to play the corporate game." Vanguard Holdings thought they were bringing a shark to the table tonight, but they did not realize I was the one baiting the hook. He took a sip of his champagne, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "I have to admit, gentlemen, your senior analysts at Vanguard are embarrassingly easy to fool," Marcus bragged, speaking directly to the lead lawyer. He thought he was talking to mere associates, simple paper pushers who would be impressed by his ruthless business tactics. I padded our active user metrics by over 300% using automated ghost accounts. I inflated our projected revenue streams with phantom vendor contracts that do not even exist. Your partners actually believed my proprietary algorithm was fully functional, but my developers have not even written the base code yet. I tripled my company valuation using nothing but smoke mirrors and a decent presentation. And today your bosses are handing me $5 million for a hollow shell. But hey, that is the tech industry, right? Only the strong survive. A murmur of impressed validation rippled through the dining room. Chloe gasped in absolute admiration, lightly smacking Jamal on the arm. Pastor Thomas gave a deep approving nod, stepping forward to place a proud hand on his son's shoulder. "The Lord rewards the cunning and the bold." Pastor Thomas proclaimed, his voice resonating with hypocritical righteousness. "You have conquered the secular world, Marcus. You took the wealth of the foolish and brought it into our family. A man must be a good steward of his blessings, and you have outsmarted the giants." Beatrice smiled proudly at her brilliant son. They celebrated his fraud. They cheered for his deception. They stood in my house drinking my champagne, praising a man for committing blatant corporate theft. It was a masterclass in toxicity, shielded by a thin veil of religious superiority. They truly believed they were untouchable, wrapped in their delusional bubble of entitlement and greed. I stood quietly by the kitchen archway, my face perfectly neutral. I watched the lead lawyer. His name was Arthur Vance. He was Vanguard Holdings' most ruthless litigator and my personal corporate counsel. Arthur adjusted his cuffs, his face betraying zero emotion as he absorbed Marcus' full, detailed confession. Every single word of financial fraud had just been spoken directly to the man hired to destroy him. Marcus finally stopped laughing, draining the last drop of his champagne. He handed the empty glass to a passing waiter and rubbed his hands together greedily. "All right, let us get the paperwork out. Where do I sign to collect my $5 million? I have a post-nuptial agreement waiting to be finalized right after this, so let us move quickly. My wife is waiting in the kitchen to sign away her rights." Arthur did not open his titanium briefcase. He did not reach into his jacket for a pen. He simply looked at Marcus with an expression of profound, chilling pity. The kind of look one gives an insect right before stepping on it. Then Arthur turned his back on my husband. He walked deliberately across the Italian tile floor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden dead silence of the room. He walked right past Pastor Thomas, who stood clutching his Bible in confusion. He walked right past Beatrice, who frowned deeply, her hands dropping to her sides. He bypassed the dining room, completely ignoring the open-mouthed stares of Chloe, Jamal, and Sierra. Arthur walked straight toward the kitchen archway. He walked straight toward me. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of where I stood, holding the unsigned post-nuptial agreement. The entire house held its collective breath. Marcus let out a nervous, confused laugh. Hey, wait, what are you doing? He asked, stepping forward, his voice cracking slightly. She is just my wife. She does not know anything about business. The deal is over here with me. Arthur ignored him completely. He snapped his heels together and bowed deeply, bending at a sharp 90-degree angle in a display of absolute unwavering respect. Madam Chief Executive Arthur said, his voice carrying the heavy authoritative weight of a thunderclap through the silent house. The hostile takeover documents are fully prepared. The audio recording of the fraud confession has been successfully secured. We await your final command. The silence in the grand foyer became absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The 10 guests in the dining room stood frozen, holding their crystal champagne flutes in mid-air. Chloe and Jamal stared with their mouths slightly ajar. Pastor Thomas and Beatrice looked as though they had been struck by lightning. Marcus shattered the silence with a loud, breathless chuckle. He slapped his hand against his thigh and forced a wide, desperate smile. "Okay, that is a hilarious icebreaker," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he looked between Arthur and me. "You guys have a fantastic sense of humor over at Vanguard. Did Jamal put you up to this? Is this some kind of stress test before we sign the term sheet?" Arthur Vance did not smile. He did not blink. He stood perfectly rigid, his cold gray eyes locked onto Marcus. "I do not make jokes regarding federal wire fraud, Mr. Jackson," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of any amusement. "And I certainly do not disrespect my chief executive officer." Marcus swallowed hard, the arrogant flush of alcohol and ego rapidly draining from his face. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically behind my wire-rimmed glasses, searching for the punchline. "Maya, tell him to stop playing around," he ordered, though his voice trembled. "Tell him to get the real paperwork out so we can close this deal." I reached up and adjusted my glasses. I took the damp linen towel I was still holding from the kitchen and let it drop from my fingers. It fluttered down, landing directly on top of Beatrice's ridiculous post-nuptial agreement, completely covering it. The submissive, quiet housewife they had spent the last 3 years mocking was officially dead. "There is no joke, Marcus," I said, stepping fully into the center of the foyer. The posture of a dutiful background wife fell away completely. I squared my shoulders and lifted my chin, projecting the exact authority I used to command boardrooms across the globe. "You wanted the Vanguard representative to arrive. He is here. You wanted to finalize your investment. We are finalizing it." Arthur stepped forward and placed his heavy titanium briefcase on the entryway table. He entered a quick combination, and the lock snapped open with a sharp mechanical click. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of pristine, legally binding corporate registration documents. He turned them around and slid them across the polished wood directly in front of Marcus. Marcus leaned over the table. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the wood to steady himself. He stared at the top page. I watched his eyes scan the bold black ink. I watched him read the words Vanguard Holdings, LLC. And right beneath that, I watched him read the words Sole Proprietor and Chief Executive Officer Maya Jackson. The color vanished from Marcus' face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to lean his entire weight against the table to keep from collapsing onto the Italian tile. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this is impossible. You are a freelance graphic designer. You draw logos." "I draw logos for my own shell companies to maintain a cover story," I corrected smoothly. "I built Vanguard Holdings from a small private equity seed portfolio long before we even met. I multiplied my assets and expanded into international venture capital, while you sat at my dining table and mocked me. I funded this house. I funded your cars. I funded every single failed business venture you have launched over the past 5 years." "This is a lie!" Beatrice screeched, suddenly snapping out of her stunned paralysis. She pushed past her husband, her heavy fur shawl slipping off her shoulder. "This is a fabricated trick. My son is a visionary. You are just trying to steal his moment. Thomas, call the police." These men are trespassing. Arthur did not even look at Beatrice. He simply tapped a thick finger against the documents on the table. The federal government, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the State Banking Authority would highly disagree with your assessment, madam, he stated coldly. Mrs. Jackson is the sole verified owner of Vanguard Holdings, and she is currently the sole creditor holding your son crushing debt. I turned my attention away from Marcus and focused on the dining room. I decided it was time to address the audience that had so eagerly cheered for my downfall. Chloe. I called out my voice, projecting clearly into the dining space. Chloe flinched, spilling a few drops of champagne onto her expensive designer dress. She looked terrified, suddenly realizing the magnitude of the situation. That magnificent 6-bedroom estate in Alpharetta you were just bragging about, I said, offering her a razor-thin smile. Vanguard Holdings recently acquired the parent company of your mortgage lender. Because Marcus used his unvalued, worthless company shares to co-sign your jumbo loan, you are now officially in default. I am calling the margin tomorrow morning. The bank will seize the property. You and Jamal have exactly 30 days to pack up your things and vacate the premises. Jamal let out a loud, choked gasp, dropping his glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes welling with terrified tears. The luxurious fantasy she had built her entire personality around had just evaporated into thin air. I shifted my gaze to Sierra, who was slowly trying to back away toward the hallway leading to the guest bathroom. "Sierra," I said sharply, freezing her in her tracks. She swallowed hard, her hands still resting nervously against her chest. "You might want to unfasten that necklace," I suggested casually. That $32,000 diamond tennis necklace was purchased using a corporate proxy account that belongs to me. Marcus used stolen funds to buy his mistress jewelry. That makes those diamonds physical evidence in a federal embezzlement and wire fraud investigation. Take it off and place it on the table right now, or my security team will detain you for possession of stolen corporate assets. Sierra's face turned stark white. Her fingers scrambled frantically at the back of her neck, clawing at the clasp. She unhooked the necklace and practically threw the glittering diamonds onto the dining table, stepping backward, as if the jewelry had suddenly caught fire. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, his chest heaving with desperate, righteous indignation. He raised his worn leather Bible, pointing it at me like a weapon. "Maya, you must stop this madness," he thundered, trying to reclaim his lost authority. "The Bible teaches us to forgive. It teaches us to be merciful. You are letting wrath poison your spirit. We are a family. You must show grace to your husband." "The Bible also says, 'Thou shalt not steal,' Thomas," I replied, my voice cutting through his religious hypocrisy like a blade. "Your son just stood in my foyer and gleefully confessed to padding user metrics, inflating revenue streams, and faking proprietary algorithms to steal $5 million from my firm. He committed federal fraud right in front of my corporate counsel. And you stood there and cheered him on, claiming it was the Lord's blessing. You do not get to use God to cover up your greed." Pastor Thomas lowered his Bible, his mouth snapping shut. He looked at Arthur Vance, who was already pulling a digital audio recorder from his suit pocket, verifying that every single word of Marcus' confession had been captured in crystal-clear high-definition audio. Marcus was hyperventilating. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. The fake tech bro alpha male persona completely shattered. He realized he was not just losing a $5 million investment. He was losing his house, his cars, his reputation, and his freedom. He was staring down the barrel of a multi-year federal prison sentence for defrauding a major venture capital firm. He dropped the arrogant facade and reverted to the desperate, pleading college boy I had met a decade ago. He stepped away from the table, tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Maya, baby, please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "It is me. It is Marcus. We are a team. I was just stressed out. I was trying to impress them. I did not mean any of what I said earlier. You are not a burden. I love you, Maya. Please do not do this to me. We can fix this. Just tell your lawyers to drop the takeover, please." He lunged forward, reaching out with both hands and grabbing my left hand tightly, squeezing my fingers as tears spilled over his cheeks. He tried to pull me into an embrace, trying to play the affection card to save his life. I looked down at his shaking hands holding mine. I felt absolutely nothing for the man standing in front of me. I violently yanked my hand out of his grip, swatting his arm away with enough force to make him stumble backward. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen whisper. "We are talking business, Mr. Jackson, and your company was just denied funding." Marcus stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the Italian tile. He looked around the foyer, wildly searching for an ally, searching for someone, anyone to tell him this was a nightmare. He looked at his mother, who was staring at me with her jaw unhinged. He looked at his father, who had lowered his Bible and was slowly backing away toward the front door. He looked into the dining room, where his elite circle of young, successful professionals had suddenly turned to stone. Nobody moved to help him, nobody offered a word of defense. The men and women who had just been cheering for his fraudulent brilliance were now looking at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. In the corporate world, failure was a sin, but being exposed as a fraud in front of a major venture capital firm was a death sentence. I did not give Marcus time to recover. I did not allow the silence to stretch into sympathy. I raised my hand and offered a brief, sharp nod to Arthur Vance. Arthur immediately unlatched the secondary compartment of his titanium briefcase. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger. It was over 200 pages long, sealed with the official gold-embossed crest of Vanguard Holdings. Arthur stepped forward and placed the heavy book directly into my hands. I held the ledger for a moment, feeling the undeniable weight of absolute truth. For 5 years, I had balanced the household budget. For 5 years, I had quietly paid the mortgage while Marcus played the role of a visionary tech founder. Now I was holding the exact forensic breakdown of every single lie he had ever told. I opened the ledger. The crisp sound of turning paper echoed loudly in the quiet house. I did not scream. I did not throw a jealous temper tantrum. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I became the ruthless chief executive officer Vanguard Holdings demanded me to be. I became a machine of pure, sterile calculation. Let us review the financial health of your startup. Mr. Jackson, I began, my voice ringing with cold, detached authority. We will start with your initial seed capital. 18 months ago, you secured $1.2 million from a group of angel investors who believed in your proprietary algorithm. According to your public filings, that money was earmarked for server acquisition and software development. Marcus wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. Maya, you do not understand, he pleaded, his voice trembling. Business is complicated. Cash flow has to be fluid to keep the operations running. Fluid is an interesting choice of words, I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the ledger. Because according to our forensic audit, exactly $450,000 flowed directly out of the corporate development account and into a private offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that miraculously pays the monthly lease on the matte black Porsche currently sitting in my driveway. You are driving a vehicle funded entirely by embezzled investor capital. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Jamal, Marcus' own brother, took a very distinct physical step away from the doorway, distancing himself from the fallout. It is a company car, Marcus stammered, his face flushing a dark shade of purple. It is for networking. You have to look successful to attract success. It is a legitimate business expense. A legitimate business expense requires a legitimate business, I countered, flipping to the next page of the ledger. But yours is nothing but a hollow shell. Let us talk about your user metrics. Tonight you proudly confess to padding your active users by 300%. But you lied even in your confession, Marcus. You did not pad your metrics, you fabricated them entirely. I looked up from the book, meeting his terrified gaze. Our cybersecurity team analyzed your server traffic. You do not have 30,000 daily active users. You have exactly 14 legitimate accounts. The rest of your traffic is generated by a cheap bot farm you rented out of Eastern Europe for $600 a month. Your proprietary algorithm is nothing more than a basic open-source template you downloaded for free. You have built absolutely nothing. You are selling a ghost. Marcus' chest heaving rapidly. He was trapped. There were no more excuses. There was no more charming his way out of the corner. He had played the ultimate game of corporate deception, and he had lost to his own wife. The guests in the dining room began to move. They were no longer a captive audience. They were fleeing a sinking ship. The self-proclaimed venture capitalists and local influencers hastily grabbed their designer coats and expensive handbags. They pushed past Chloe and Jamal, murmuring frantic apologies, as they rushed toward the back exit. They wanted absolutely no association with a man about to be indicted for federal wire fraud. Marcus spun around, reaching out toward the dining room. "Wait, please do not leave," he begged, his voice cracking. "I can explain. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. I am pivoting the platform." Nobody stopped. Within 30 seconds, the dining room was completely abandoned, save for Chloe, Jamal, and Sierra. I turned my attention to the final section of the audit. "And then there are the personal expenditures," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The funds you bled from the company to finance your personal entertainment. Let us review the past 6 months. $32,000 to a boutique jeweler in Paris. $14,000 for private weekend getaways to Miami. $8,000 for luxury dining and hotel accommodations, all charged to the corporate card and classified as client acquisition costs." I closed the heavy ledger and handed it back to Arthur. I looked directly at Sierra, who was still standing near the dining table, looking pale and completely humiliated without her diamond necklace. "You drained the last remaining drops of your investor capital to fund an affair?" I stated, my eyes locked on Marcus. "You called me a financial burden in front of your friends while you were actively stealing the money I put into our joint accounts to pay for your mistress' hotel rooms. You are not just a failure, Marcus. You are a common thief." Beatrice finally found her voice. She stepped forward, grabbing Pastor Thomas by the arm. "This is a setup," she shrieked, her voice trembling with panic and rage. "You deliberately orchestrated this, Maya. You set my son up to fail. You are a wicked, vindictive woman. We are leaving Thomas. We are not staying in this house of deceit a single second longer." Pastor Thomas did not argue. The man who had just demanded I submit to my husband was now practically sprinting toward the front door, eager to escape the legal blast radius. They shoved the heavy doors open and hurried out into the cold night, leaving their golden child completely undefended. Marcus stood alone in the center of the foyer, a broken, hollow shell of a man. His shoulders slumped and he buried his face in his hands, letting out a quiet, pathetic sob. But the silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp clatter of high heels. Sierra marched out of the dining room, her emerald gown swishing angrily around her ankles. She stopped next to Marcus, crossing her arms over her chest. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier was gone, replaced by a fierce, desperate arrogance. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure defiance. "You think you are so smart?" Maya Sierra spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just swoop in here and destroy everything we have worked for? Well, you cannot just seize the company. You are forgetting one very important legal detail." I tilted my head, studying her. "Please, Sierra," I said calmly. "Enlighten me." Sierra lifted her chin, attempting to look intimidating. "I am not just a guest here tonight," she declared. "I am the chief operating officer of the platform. Marcus and I built this vision together. I helped draft the original business plan. I have a registered 20% equity stake in the corporation. I am a legally documented co-founder. You cannot freeze the accounts or dissolve the assets without my explicit executive consent. I have rights to those funds." She looked incredibly smug, believing she had found the ultimate legal loophole. She thought her official corporate title protected her from the fallout. She thought she was untouchable. I could not help it. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound completely devoid of humor. I turned slightly and held out my hand. Arthur Vance immediately unclasped the final document from his briefcase. It was a slender red folder. He placed it firmly into my palm. I walked slowly across the foyer, the sound of my heels echoing against the tile. I stopped directly in front of Sierra. I did not hand her the folder. I simply pressed it hard against her chest, forcing her to grab it to keep it from falling. "You are absolutely right, Sierra." I said, my voice a low, lethal purr. "You are a legally registered co-founder. You are a documented executive officer with direct signing authority on the corporate accounts." Sierra frowned, looking down at the red folder in her hands. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "That is a formal civil lawsuit and a notification of criminal referral," I explained, stepping back and clasping my hands together. "Because you are an official executive officer, you are legally liable for the missing capital. By officially registering yourself as a co-founder, you made yourself an active accomplice to federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the misappropriation of investor funds. You did not secure a financial future tonight, Sierra. You secured a federal indictment." Sierra's mouth fell open. Her confident posture completely collapsed. She stared at the red folder, her hands beginning to shake violently. The reality of the document crashed into her, tearing away her arrogant facade and leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at Marcus, expecting him to save her, but Marcus just stared at the floor, entirely consumed by his own ruin. "You wanted to be his partner," I said, turning my back on both of them and walking toward the front door. "Now you get to share his prison sentence." I paused at the heavy oak threshold of the front door. The cool night air brushed against my face, but I did not step outside. I slowly turned back around, letting my gaze sweep over the absolute devastation I had just orchestrated. The grand foyer of the Jackson estate was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a corporate slaughterhouse. The remaining guests in the dining room finally broke their paralyzed trances. The tech associates and mid-level venture capitalists Marcus had invited to witness his triumphant ascension suddenly realized they were standing at ground zero of an active federal crime scene. A man in a sharp blue suit, who had just toasted Marcus' brilliance, dropped his crystal champagne flute onto the dining table. He backed away, holding his hands up in a gesture of frantic surrender. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this," the man announced, his voice pitched high with sudden panic. "I am not an investor. I have not signed a single non-disclosure agreement. We are just casual acquaintances." He practically sprinted past Arthur Vance, keeping a wide berth, as if Marcus were suddenly radioactive. The others immediately followed suit. A stampede of expensive leather shoes and panicked whispers echoed through the grand house. They scrambled over each other to reach the coat check, leaving Marcus completely isolated. None of them wanted their names anywhere near a Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena. Within 60 seconds, the expansive dining room was completely empty, save for the shattered glass and abandoned champagne flutes. Sierra looked down at the red folder trembling in her hands, and then at the backs of the fleeing guests. The reality of the criminal referral had completely shattered her arrogant facade. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The smug mistress who had mocked me in my own kitchen was gone. In her place stood a terrified little girl staring at the total destruction of her entire life. "Maya, please," Sierra choked out, stepping forward and holding the folder out as if trying to hand back a live grenade. "You have to believe me. You have to listen to reason. I did not know the user metrics were entirely fabricated. I just handled the marketing and the social media presence. Marcus handled all the back-end code and the financial spreadsheets. I am just the operations manager. I never authorized the embezzlement of venture capital. I never asked for that diamond necklace. He bought it for me. He told me it was a bonus from his personal account. You cannot hold me criminally liable for his lies." That was the exact moment Marcus Jackson proved to everyone in the room what kind of man he truly was. A cornered rat will always bite whatever is closest to survive. Marcus snapped his head up. His tear-streaked face suddenly twisted into a mask of vicious, desperate rage. The charming facade he used to navigate the world evaporated, revealing the ugly, cowardly core of his character. He lunged toward Sierra, pointing an accusatory finger directly at her face. "Shut your mouth, you lying parasite!" Marcus screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. You knew exactly what we were doing. Do not stand here and play the innocent victim. You were the one who suggested we pad the user numbers. You were the one who set up the ghost accounts through that overseas vendor because you said we needed leverage. Sierra gasped, taking a physical step back, as if he had struck her across the jaw. Marcus, how could you? She whispered, her voice trembling with absolute shock. I loved you. I risked my entire professional career for you. I stood by you when your wife would not. You risked nothing, Marcus fired back, advancing on her and forcing her to retreat against the edge of the dining table. You leeched off me. You manipulated me into buying you that $32,000 necklace. You said you would leave the company and expose the raw data to the investors if I did not compensate you for your silence. You extorted me. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and frantic. The sheer desperation radiating from his body was pathetic. He had completely abandoned the woman he had promised a grand future to just seconds earlier, throwing her directly into the line of fire to save his own skin. Maya, you have to listen to me, Marcus pleaded, dropping to his knees on the Italian tile. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me with pathetic, wet eyes. She blackmailed me. She orchestrated the entire offshore shell company. She is the chief operating officer. She signed the financial disclosures right alongside me. I was just trying to build a legitimate platform to provide for our family, but she poisoned the data. You have the leverage, Maya. You are the CEO of Vanguard. Give the federal authorities her name. Send her to prison. She is the one who ruined our marriage. I was a victim of her manipulation. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering affection. I simply watched him meticulously destroy whatever shred of dignity he had left. Before I could instruct Arthur to call the authorities and make the situation official, a sharp, arrogant voice cut through the heavy tension in the foyer. This is completely and utterly unacceptable. Chloe stepped out from the shadows of the dining room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jamal stood slightly behind her, looking absolutely terrified. He clearly wanted to run out the back door with the rest of the guests, but his wife stood her ground. Chloe possessed the unique, unwavering audacity of a woman who had never faced a real consequence in her entire life. She looked me up and down with an expression of profound aristocratic disgust. You really think you can just march in here and play God? Maya, Chloe demanded, stepping into the center of the room and blocking my view of Marcus. You are completely out of line. You have orchestrated this entire cruel charade because you are a bitter, jealous woman who could not keep her husband happy. I slowly turned my full attention to my sister-in-law. Arthur Vance stiffened beside me, his eyes narrowing at the sheer disrespect being directed at his employer. But I held up a single finger, signaling him to stand down. Excuse me, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You heard me. Chloe snapped, her tone dripping with extreme condescension. She spoke to me as if I were a disobedient servant rather than the woman holding the deed to her house. You think flashing some corporate documents makes you powerful? It just makes you look desperate and pathetic. Marcus is a visionary, so what if he exaggerated a few numbers to get his business off the ground? That is what every successful tech founder does in this industry. It is called marketing. You are abusing your sudden corporate power to settle a petty domestic dispute. I'm not going to stand here and let you ruin an innocent man's life over your bruised ego. Chloe took another step forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She completely ignored the fact that Marcus had just admitted to federal wire fraud on a recorded device. She only cared that her comfortable reality was being threatened by a woman she deemed beneath her. I have highly connected lawyers, Maya Chloe threatened, her voice rising with entitlement. Real lawyers, not this corporate intimidation squad you brought into our home to bully us. If you do not withdraw this ridiculous civil lawsuit and reinstate the venture capital funding for Marcus Company right this second, I will personally ensure you are sued for corporate sabotage, defamation, and emotional distress. I will drag you through civil court until you are bankrupt. You will lose everything you have hidden from this family. I looked at Chloe. Her face was flushed with the kind of outrage reserved for royalty who had just been insulted by a peasant. She truly believed her aggressive tone would force me into submission. It was almost fascinating to watch someone so fundamentally powerless try to wield an authority she did not possess. She stood there in her designer gown, radiating false superiority, completely blind to the reality of the tidal wave that was about to hit her. "Bankrupt me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the foyer. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my heels clicking sharply against the tile. "You want to drag me through civil court, Chloe. You want to threaten my personal assets. That is a very bold strategy for a woman who does not even legally own the shoes she is wearing tonight." Chloe scoffed loudly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "You are insane," she spat. "You have completely lost your mind. Jamal, tell this psychotic woman to back off before I call the police myself." Jamal did not move. He was staring at Arthur Vance, who was silently retrieving a sleek black tablet from the secondary compartment of his titanium briefcase. Jamal was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. He recognized the predatory look in a corporate lawyer's eyes, and he knew instinctually that running was his best option. But his wife, arrogant and oblivious, had anchored them both to the sinking ship. I did not break eye contact with Chloe as I reached out and took the tablet from Arthur. I tapped the screen, bringing up a highly detailed, heavily documented financial web. "Let us talk about real lawyers, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical registry. "Let us talk about corporate sabotage and the exact definition of fraud." Jamal stepped forward. "Do not hide behind your wife while I dissect your entire life." Jamal swallowed hard, wiping a trembling hand across his mouth as he took a reluctant step out of the shadows. He looked at Marcus, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping quietly, but Marcus refused to meet his brother's eyes. Marcus had already thrown his mistress to the wolves to save his own skin, and Jamal knew he would not hesitate to do the same to his own blood. "Your boutique marketing firm has exactly one major client, Jamal," I stated, reading directly from the glowing screen of the tablet. "Marcus Tech Startup. Over the past 18 months, your firm has billed his company for over $400,000 in vague consulting fees and brand management retainers. Yet according to our forensic audit, you never delivered a single marketing campaign. You never ran a single advertisement. You never even drafted a press release." I turned the tablet so Chloe could see the bright glaring numbers highlighted in red. "You acted as a money laundering funnel, Jamal. You set up a fake vendor contract to siphon venture capital out of Marcus' company and directly into your personal checking account. You helped him drain the investors dry so you could maintain the illusion of wealth." "That is a lie," Chloe shrieked, slapping her hand against the side of the doorframe. "Jamal works hard. He built his agency from the ground up. You are just making this up to humiliate us because you are bitter and pathetic." "I do not need to make anything up, Chloe," I countered, my tone razor sharp. "I have the bank statements. I have the wire transfer receipts. Do you know what stolen investor capital buys, Chloe? It buys the $60,000 first-class vacation to Milan you posted all over social media last spring. It buys the custom-built walk-in closet currently holding over $200,000 in vintage Hermes handbags. It buys the $80,000 luxury SUV parked outside my house right now. Your entire aristocratic aesthetic, every single piece of your high society persona is funded entirely by corporate theft." Chloe's face turned the color of ash. Her aggressive posture began to crumble. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. "Jamal, tell her she is lying," Chloe demanded, her voice trembling. "Tell her we earned our money." Jamal could not speak. He just stared at the floor, his hands shaking violently at his sides. Marcus suddenly scrambled to his feet, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. He pointed a desperate, shaking finger at his brother. "He made me do it," Marcus yelled, throwing Jamal under the bus with zero hesitation. "Jamal told me the investors would never notice the missing funds. He said setting up the vendor contract was standard industry practice for early-stage startups. He extorted me, Maya. He said he would tell you about Sierra if I did not approve the marketing invoices. I was backed into a corner." "They are parasites, Maya. Both of them." "You spineless coward," Jamal roared, lunging toward Marcus. "I covered your tracks for 3 years. I hid your massive debts from Dad. I lied to Maya for you. You begged me to set up those invoices because you needed liquid cash to pay off your private gambling markers." "Enough," I commanded, my voice echoing violently through the foyer, instantly silencing both brothers. I do not care which one of you originated the fraud. You are both equally liable, and you are both going to federal prison. But right now we are going to finish discussing the immediate consequences of your actions. I turned my full attention back to Chloe. She was shaking her arms wrapped tightly around her waist as if trying to physically hold herself together. Let us talk about your house, Chloe, I said softly, taking another step toward her. That beautiful 6-bedroom estate in Alpharetta. The one you love to host charity galas in, so you can pretend to be a pillar of Atlanta high society. You and Jamal did not have the credit score or the verifiable income to secure that jumbo mortgage on your own. You needed a guarantor. You needed Marcus to co-sign the loan. Chloe's lips trembled, but she refused to speak. She knew exactly where this was going, and she was entirely powerless to stop it. Marcus pledged his equity shares in his tech startup as collateral for your mortgage. I explained, speaking slowly so every word would sink into her deeply entitled brain. The regional bank accepted those shares based on the fraudulent, overinflated valuation Marcus provided. He lied on a federal loan application to secure your mansion. But there is a massive problem with that arrangement, Chloe. I handed the tablet back to Arthur and folded my hands neatly in front of me. 2 months ago, Vanguard Holdings quietly acquired the parent company of the regional bank that holds your mortgage note, I revealed, watching the last remaining drop of arrogance drain from her face. I am essentially your bank. I hold the paper on your perfect suburban dream. And since the collateral securing your loan is completely fraudulent, the terms of the mortgage are officially in default. You cannot do that, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. We have rights. We have been making the monthly payments. There is an eviction process. You cannot just take our home away from us. We are family. I am not taking your home, Chloe, I stated, my voice completely devoid of empathy. You never owned it in the first place. You have been squatting in a mansion paid for by my stolen money. You built your entire life on a foundation of lies and theft. And when it comes to recovering stolen corporate assets, Vanguard Holdings does not wait for standard eviction protocols. We do not send polite warning letters, we execute immediate asset seizure. Right on cue, a sharp, jarring ringtone pierced the silence in the foyer. It was loud, obnoxious, and coming directly from Jamal's suit pocket. Jamal flinched as if the phone had physically burned him. He did not reach for it. He just stood there staring at me with wide, terrified eyes while the phone continued to ring. Answer it, I commanded, pointing at his pocket. Put it on speaker. Jamal's hands shook so violently he dropped the phone twice before finally managing to swipe the screen and press the speaker button. He held the device out in front of him like a ticking bomb. Hello, Jamal, croaked, his voice barely audible. Mr. Jackson, a stern professional voice boomed from the phone speaker. This is Harrison, the estate manager for the Alpharetta Homeowners Association. I am standing in your driveway right now, and we have a very serious situation on our hands. Chloe let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. There are 4 federal marshals and a bank repossession team currently securing your property. The estate manager continued, his tone completely unsympathetic. They have presented a federal warrant for immediate asset seizure. They are actively changing the locks on the front doors. A moving crew is currently boxing up all of your personal belongings and placing them on the curb outside the main gate. They have also loaded your vehicles onto flatbed tow trucks. You need to get down here immediately, Mr. Jackson. You are officially locked out of the community. Jamal dropped the phone. It hit the Italian tile with a sharp crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of broken glass. The estate manager voice continued to echo from the floor, demanding an immediate response, but nobody answered him. Chloe collapsed to her knees, letting out a gut-wrenching wail of absolute despair. The luxurious fantasy she had so viciously defended had just been ripped away, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the impending threat of federal prosecution. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of my foyer. I looked down at her, then shifted my gaze to Marcus and Jamal. The 3 of them were completely broken, stripped of their arrogance, their stolen wealth, and their fake status. They were finally experiencing the exact devastation they had so casually planned for me. Arthur Vance stepped forward, picking up the broken phone and terminating the call. He looked at me, his expression perfectly neutral, but I could see the faint gleam of professional satisfaction in his cold gray eyes. Madam Chief Executive Arthur said, his voice calm and precise. The primary assets have been successfully secured. The authorities have been notified regarding the fraudulent activities of the Kyo signers. Are there any further actions required tonight? I looked around the grand foyer, taking in the shattered remnants of the Jackson family ego. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. "No, Arthur," I replied, turning my back on the weeping traitors on my floor. "I think the garbage has finally taken itself out. Call the cleaning crew. I want this house completely sanitized by morning." The heavy mahogany front doors suddenly violently swung inward, hitting the walls with a thunderous crack. The cold night wind swept through the grand foyer, bringing with it the distant sound of police sirens and the harsh flashing of red and blue lights from the street. Beatrice and Pastor Thomas marched back into the house. Their desperate attempt to flee the blast radius had been completely thwarted. The federal marshals securing Jamal and Chloe vehicles had barricaded the iron gates of the estate, locking the entire property down. There was no escape. They were trapped inside the nightmare they had helped create. Beatrice's face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "We could not even get our car out of the driveway because of your circus." Maya, she spat, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "There are federal agents swarming the lawn, treating us like common criminals. You march out there right now and tell them to let us leave." I did not move a single muscle. I simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch until her false bravado began to waver. Pastor Thomas stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest and attempting to summon the booming authoritative voice he used to command his congregation every Sunday morning. He glared at me with absolute righteous indignation, completely ignoring the fact that his two sons were currently facing imminent federal prosecution. "You have lost your mind, Maya," Thomas thundered, pointing a heavy finger at my face. "You are acting under the influence of pure wickedness. You have allowed bitterness and spite to poison your heart. A wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. You are a destructive force. You are a demon sent to tear this righteous family apart. You will call off these corporate thugs, you will drop these ridiculous lawsuits, and you will submit to the order of this family before the wrath of God falls upon you." He stood tall, expecting me to cower. For years he had used his religious authority as a weapon to silence any dissent within his family. He weaponized scripture to excuse Marcus' terrible behavior, to force me into silent obedience, and to maintain his illusion of ultimate control. He truly believed his booming voice and theological threats made him untouchable. I looked at his expensive tailored suit. I looked at the gold Rolex flashing on his wrist. I looked at the sheer, unabashed hypocrisy radiating from every pore of his body. I slowly turned to the side and held out my hand. Arthur Vance did not hesitate. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick navy blue binder sealed with the emblem of an elite forensic accounting firm. He placed it firmly into my palm. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his shouting. I spoke with the quiet, lethal precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "Let us talk about your righteous house, Thomas," I said, stripping away his pastoral title and addressing him simply as the corrupt man he was. "Let us talk about the wrath of God and the exact nature of your family morality." Thomas frowned, his authoritative posture faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. I opened the navy blue binder. The crisp white pages inside were filled with thousands of lines of transactional data, highlighted routing numbers, and offshore account balances. 6 months ago, I began tracking the missing capital from Marcus' startup, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Thomas. I knew he was draining the investor funds, but I could not figure out how he was cleaning the money. The offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands were just holding pens. He needed a domestic entity to wash the funds so he could spend them freely in the United States without triggering an IRS audit. He needed an entity with absolute financial opacity. He needed an entity that was legally exempt from federal tax scrutiny. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He needed your church, Thomas. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Thomas' face instantly drained of all color. The booming righteous pastor completely vanished, replaced by a terrified old man staring directly into the barrel of a loaded gun. "That is a lie." Thomas stammered, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. "Grace Fellowship is a sanctuary. We do the Lord work. You are speaking blasphemy." "I am speaking mathematics," I countered, flipping to a highlighted page in the binder. "Mathematics do not lie." According to these subpoenaed banking records, Marcus transferred exactly $600,000 of stolen investor capital from his Cayman Shell Company directly into the Grace Fellowship Orphan Outreach Fund. You categorize those massive wire transfers as anonymous cash tithes. I flipped to the next page, letting the sound of the rustling paper fill the suffocating silence of the foyer. Once the stolen money was safely sitting inside your tax-exempt charity accounts, you needed a way to funnel it back to Marcus? I continued, my tone completely detached and analytical. "So you created a fake vendor contract. You hired Marcus Dummy Corporation to provide non-existent IT infrastructure and digital consulting for the church. You paid him back his own stolen money using church funds, effectively washing the capital and making it look like legitimate corporate income." I snapped the binder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "But you did not do it for free, did you, Thomas?" I asked, tilting my head and studying his horrified expression. "A holy man still has to eat. You kept a 20% processing fee for every single fraudulent transaction. You stole $120,000 of venture capital meant for software development and used it to buy the luxury sedan your wife drives to Sunday service. You are not a spiritual leader, Thomas. You are a high-level money launderer running a criminal syndicate out of a tax-exempt sanctuary." "You cannot prove any of this," Beatrice shrieked, stepping out from behind her husband. Her face was flushed dark purple, her eyes wild with panic. "The church books are private. You have no legal authority to access those accounts. You are a malicious, vindictive liar." I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made Beatrice physically recoil. "You are absolutely right, Beatrice," I said softly. "I do not have the legal authority to audit a church. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division certainly does. And so does the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." Thomas staggered backward, as if I had driven a physical blade into his chest. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He reached out, grabbing the edge of a marble entryway console to keep himself from collapsing. "I made a digital copy of this entire binder," I revealed, stepping back and handing the physical copy to Arthur. I included the unredacted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, the fake vendor invoices, and the exact dates of every single wire transfer. I handed that encrypted drive over to a federal prosecutor at 8 o'clock this morning. They already have everything. The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer weight of my words crushed the last remaining breath out of the room. "They are going to strip your church of its tax-exempt status," Thomas the Wise stated, delivering the final devastating blow. "They are going to freeze all of your personal and religious assets. They are going to subpoena your entire congregation and lay your criminal enterprise bare for everyone in the city to see. You use the name of God to steal from investors and enrich yourself. You will not just lose your church, Thomas. You are going to spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary for tax evasion and money laundering." Beatrice's legs completely gave out. She let out a hollow whimpering sound and collapsed backward onto a velvet entryway bench. She stared blankly at the wall, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The woman who had spent years looking down her nose at me, who had judged my clothes, my career, and my worth as a wife, was now utterly destroyed. Her social standing, her wealth, her entire identity had been vaporized in less than 5 minutes. Pastor Thomas did not try to comfort his wife. He did not try to quote scripture or summon his righteous anger. He simply slid down the wall, his expensive suit wrinkling as he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his hands, a broken, ruined old man facing the absolute certainty of his own demise. The Jackson family, the untouchable elite circle of arrogance and entitlement, had been completely dismantled. Chloe and Jamal were locked out of a seized home facing bankruptcy and fraud charges. Thomas and Beatrice were waiting for federal agents to raid their church. Sierra was staring down a criminal referral for embezzlement. And Marcus. I turned my eyes to the center of the floor. Marcus was no longer standing. He was entirely isolated. His mistress had turned on him. His brother had cursed him. His parents were destroyed because of him. There was no one left to charm. There was no one left to manipulate. The grand illusion of his brilliant success had been burned to ash and scattered to the wind. Marcus slowly looked up at me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. He looked at the empty dining room, the shattered champagne glasses, the weeping forms of his parents, and the cold, unforgiving posture of the federal lawyers standing behind me. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely and utterly alone. "Maya," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. He dragged himself across the Italian tile, crawling on his hands and knees until he reached my feet. He reached out with trembling hands, lightly grasping the hem of my tailored trousers. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute terror. "Maya, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto my expensive shoes. "Please do not do this to me. I have nothing left." I looked down at the top of his head, watching his shoulders heave with violent, exaggerated sobs. He clung to the fabric of my trousers like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. The sheer irony of the visual was almost poetic in its cruelty. Less than an hour ago, he had stood in the center of my dining room, swirling a glass of expensive vintage champagne and publicly declaring me a financial burden. He had allowed his mistress to mock me in my own home. He had allowed his family to disrespect me to my face. He had basked in the unearned admiration of his peers while standing on a foundation paid for by my quiet labor. Now he was wiping his running nose on the hem of my pants, entirely stripped of his pride. "Maya, please listen to me," he wept, his voice muffled against my leg. I lost my way. The pressure was just too much. "You know what it is like out there in the corporate world. You know the expectations placed on me. I had to project success. I had to look like a winner to get the initial funding. As a minority founder in the tech space, they look for any reason to deny you capital. It was a fake it until you make it strategy that just got completely out of hand. I never meant to steal anything from anyone. It was just a temporary reallocation of funds to keep the servers running. I was going to put it all back once the platform monetized." He lifted his face, his features contorted in a mask of pathetic desperation. "And Sierra, she was relentless. Maya. She knew I was stressed and she preyed on me. She manipulated my vulnerabilities when I was at my weakest. I was working 80-hour weeks trying to build an empire for us, for our future family, and she just forced her way into my life. She threatened to expose the padded user metrics if I did not buy her those gifts and take her on those trips. I was trapped in a web of her making. I did it all for you, Maya. I just wanted to be the ultimate provider this family expected me to be. I wanted to make you proud." I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I felt only a profound clinical disgust. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing his hands to slip off my trousers. His palms hit the cold tile with a wet slap. "Do not dare use my name to justify your greed, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that echoed clearly across the silent foyer. "Do not insult my intelligence by claiming you bought your mistress diamond necklaces and luxury hotel rooms to protect our marriage. You did not build an empire for us. You built a house of cards for your own fragile ego. You stole money because you were too incompetent to earn it, and you cheated because you are fundamentally hollow. You are exactly the fraud I just proved you to be." The last remaining catering staff who had been quietly clearing the dining room had stopped moving entirely. They stood frozen by the swinging kitchen doors, watching the self-proclaimed tech visionary grovel on the floor. The humiliation was absolute and public. There was no public relations spin that could ever fix this narrative. The man who had hired a string quartet to announce his fake success was now weeping in front of the hired help. Marcus tried to reach for me again, but Arthur Vance stepped forward smoothly, planting his polished Oxford shoe directly between Marcus and my personal space. Marcus shrank back, instantly intimidated by the silent, towering authority of the corporate lawyer. "Maya, we can fix this," Marcus pleaded, looking up at me from behind Arthur's leg, his voice cracking with panic. "You have Vanguard holdings. You have massive capital reserves. We can pay back the angel investors tomorrow morning. We can buy off Sierra and make her sign a non-disclosure agreement. We can move the church funds back into the charity accounts before the federal investigators execute their warrants. You are a financial genius, Maya. You always know how to fix broken things. Please help me. You are my wife. We took vows before God, for better or for worse. You cannot just abandon me when I am down." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute detachment from reality. He was staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar federal indictment, and he still thought he could use my money to patch the holes in his sinking ship. He still believed that the marriage contract bound me to his sinking anchor. He actually thought he could manipulate my loyalty one last time. I turned slightly toward Beatrice, who was still slumped against the wall, hyperventilating into her hands. Pastor Thomas remained frozen on the floor beside her, his eyes vacant and staring at nothing. I smiled. It was a thin, razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "Speaking of our marriage contract," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clarity through the tense air of the foyer, "I believe we have one final piece of business to conclude tonight." I held out my hand without looking back. Arthur Vance immediately reached into the deepest secured compartment of his titanium briefcase. He pulled out a single crisp document encased in a clear protective sleeve. He placed it firmly into my waiting palm. I stepped past Arthur and looked down at Marcus. I held the document up so the harsh foyer lighting illuminated the bold black text at the top of the page. Marcus squinted his tear-filled eyes, struggling to read the legal heading through his blurred vision. "Do you remember this document, Marcus?" I asked softly, kneeling down slightly so I was closer to his eye level. "Your mother certainly does." Just 3 hours ago, before the caterers even arrived, Beatrice cornered me in the kitchen. She shoved this exact piece of paper into my hands and demanded that I sign it immediately. She told me it was for the absolute protection of the Jackson family legacy. She told me that I was a liability to your grand success. Marcus' face went completely slack. The desperate, frantic energy drained out of his body, leaving him paralyzed. His eyes widened to the size of saucers as he recognized the thick legal stock and his mother's distinctive gold-embossed notary seal pressed into the bottom right corner of the page. "It is a formal postnuptial agreement," I explained, my voice steady and entirely victorious. "Your mother was so incredibly terrified that I would try to claim half of your brilliant tech startup in a divorce. She was so convinced that I was a gold-digging burden who contributed absolutely nothing to this household. She demanded that I sign away all of my marital rights to your corporate assets, your future earnings, and your vast business holdings. She wanted to make sure I left this marriage with nothing." Beatrice let out a weak, choked sob from the floor, suddenly realizing the catastrophic trap she had just set for her own son. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, shaking her head violently side to side. "The absolute best part about this contract, Marcus," I continued, my tone laced with lethal satisfaction, "is the specific liability clause your mother so meticulously drafted. In her rush to ensure I got absolutely none of your imaginary wealth, she also included an ironclad stipulation that I assume absolutely zero responsibility for your corporate debts, your legal liabilities, or your financial obligations. She legally severed our financial lives completely and totally. She built a massive, impenetrable wall between my assets and your crimes." "No," Marcus whispered, his voice barely a breath. He shook his head frantically, scrambling backward on the tile. "No, Maya, you did not sign it. Tell me you threw it away. Tell me you did not sign it." "I signed it, Marcus," I replied, tapping my manicured fingernail against the freshly inked signature line at the bottom of the page. "I signed it the second she handed it to me. and Arthur Vance had it digitally filed, legally notarized, and officially ratified by a state judge an hour before this party even started. I stood back up, towering over the broken man on the floor. Your mother handed me the exact legal shield I needed to walk away from your federal wire fraud charges completely unscathed, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You wanted to protect your assets from me, Marcus. Congratulations. They are fully protected, and my entire fortune is permanently protected from your prison sentence. You are entirely on your own. Marcus stared up at me, the reality of his mother's fatal miscalculation draining the last remnants of color from his face. The very document Beatrice had designed to leave me destitute had become my impenetrable fortress. I held out my free hand. Arthur moved with practiced efficiency, placing a silver fountain pen and a second stack of documents into my palm. These were not corporate binders or financial audits. These were printed on thick ivory legal paper. I dropped the stack directly onto the floor in front of Marcus' knees. The pages fanned out slightly across the Italian tile. Those are the final divorce decrees and the immediate asset relinquishment forms, I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the foyer. They are drafted to mirror the exact stipulations of the post-nuptial agreement your mother so generously provided. It clearly dictates that whoever holds title to an asset prior to the dissolution of the marriage retains sole ownership, and whoever incurred a liability retains sole responsibility. Marcus looked down at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. He shook his head, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. I am not signing that, he stammered, his voice a raspy whisper. Maya, you cannot leave me with nothing. I have millions in corporate debt. The investors are going to seize everything. I will be bankrupt. I will be ruined. You are already ruined, Marcus, I replied, my expression unmoving. The only question left is whether you leave this house as a bankrupt free man with a chance to arrange a plea deal, or if you leave in the back of a federal transport vehicle. I pointed toward the heavy oak front doors. Beyond the thick wood, the rhythmic flashing of red and blue police lights continued to paint the frosted glass panels. The federal authorities are currently at the perimeter of the estate, managing the seizure of your brother vehicles, I explained, my tone conversational yet deadly. But I have the commanding agent direct cell phone number. If you do not sign these papers right now, relinquishing any and all claims to this house, my company and my personal accounts, I will make the call. I will invite them inside. I will hand them the original hard drives containing your forged user data, your offshore routing numbers, and the exact logs of your embezzlement. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs in front of every neighbor on this street. Maya, please, Marcus begged, pressing his hands flat against the documents on the floor. You do not have to do this. We can fight this together. I will do whatever you want. I will go to counseling. I will fix the business. Just give me a chance to make it right. I looked at him with absolute disgust. The sheer audacity of his bargaining was staggering. He was a man drowning in an ocean of his own making, still trying to negotiate the price of a life preserver. You lost the right to negotiate the second you bought another woman a diamond necklace with stolen money, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. You lost the right to my mercy the second you stood in my dining room and called me a financial burden while secretly bleeding my accounts dry. Pick up the pen, Marcus. Marcus turned his head, frantically searching the room for an ally. He looked at Sierra, but his former mistress had backed away, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself invisible to the legal fallout. He looked at Jamal and Chloe, but they were entirely consumed by the reality of their own impending homelessness. Finally, he looked at his parents. Dad. Marcus choked out, his voice cracking. Mom, please tell her she cannot do this to us. Pastor Thomas did not move. The man who had built an entire career projecting righteous authority was now sitting on the floor, hugging his knees, looking completely hollowed out. He did not have a single scripture left to weaponize. Beatrice was weeping into her hands, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. They had no salvation to offer him. Their holy empire was collapsing right alongside his tech illusion. No one is coming to save you, Marcus, I said, forcing his attention back to me. The facade is over. The audience has gone home. Pick up the pen and sign the papers. Marcus' chest heaved as a fresh wave of panic washed over him. He realized there was no escape route. The charm and the smiles that had carried him through his entire adult life were utterly useless against raw documented facts. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the silver fountain pen Arthur had placed on the floor. He picked it up. The heavy metal seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in his grip. He looked up at me one last time, his eyes swimming with tears. "I hope you are happy, Maya." He spat, his voice suddenly twisting with a venomous, bitter edge. "I hope destroying your own family brings you peace. You are cold. You have no heart." I did not flinch. I did not offer him a reaction. I simply stared at him, waiting. Marcus lowered his head. He pressed the nib of the pen to the signature line on the first page. His hand shook so violently that the ink smeared, but he managed to scratch his name across the paper. He flipped to the next page and signed again. The only sound in the massive grand foyer was the harsh, frantic scratching of the pen against the legal documents and the quiet, muffled sobs of his mother. He signed away his claim to the Beacon Hill estate. He signed away his claim to my investment portfolios. He signed away any right to spousal support. He legally bound himself to the millions of dollars in fraudulent debt he had accumulated. He executed his own financial death sentence stroke by stroke. When he reached the final page, he signed his name and dropped the pen onto the tile. It clattered loudly, rolling away and coming to a stop near my shoe. Marcus stayed on his knees, staring blankly at the executed documents. His shoulders slumped forward, perfectly illustrating the total defeat of a man who had finally been stripped of his unearned superiority. Arthur Vance stepped forward smoothly, bending down to gather the paperwork. He checked each signature line with precise professional scrutiny, verifying that the legal trap was fully secured. He tapped the documents against the side of his briefcase, organizing them before sliding them safely into a locked compartment. "The asset separation is legally binding and complete," Madam Chief Executive Arthur announced, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, keeping my posture rigid. Marcus let out a long, shaky breath. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his movements stiff and uncoordinated like an old man. He did not look at me. He did not look at anyone in the room. His eyes were fixed firmly on the ground, completely devoid of the arrogance that had defined him for years. "Fine, Marcus," muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. "You win, Maya. You got exactly what you wanted. You stripped me of everything. I am leaving." He turned his body away from the front door and took a heavy, dragging step toward the grand, sweeping staircase that led to the second floor of the estate. "I will go upstairs and pack my things," Marcus mumbled, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I will be out of your house in an hour. Just give me time to gather my clothes and my computer." He took another step, placing his hand on the polished mahogany banister. He placed his foot on the first carpeted step, entirely ready to retreat to the master suite and lick his wounds. I did not raise my voice. I simply gave a sharp, precise nod. Suddenly, a massive figure stepped out from the shadowed hallway adjacent to the stairs. It was not Arthur Vance. It was the lead security contractor I had hired for the evening. A towering man built like a brick wall, wearing a dark tactical suit and an expression of absolute unyielding authority. The security contractor moved with terrifying speed, planting his heavy boots directly onto the second step and completely blocking Marcus' path. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, staring down at my soon-to-be ex-husband like a bouncer preparing to eject a violent patron. Marcus froze, his foot hovering over the stairs. He looked up at the massive security guard and then slowly turned his head to look back at me, confusion and fresh panic flashing across his features. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, his voice trembling as he pointed a shaking finger at the guard. "Maya, call your dog off. I just need to get my clothes." I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the final absolute boundary. "You are not going upstairs, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood against the marble walls. "You are not packing a single bag. You are not taking your computer. You are walking out of that front door right now with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." Marcus stared at me, his jaw dropping open. He looked from me to the massive security contractor and back again, his mind struggling to process this new level of denial. "Maya, you cannot be serious," he stammered, a frantic edge bleeding into his tone. "I live here. This is my house too. Half of everything in this estate belongs to me. My custom suits are up there. My watches are up there. My work laptop is on my desk. You cannot legally keep me from retrieving my own personal property." I let out a short, hollow laugh that made Marcus physically flinch. "You still do not understand how thoroughly you have been outplayed, Marcus," I replied, taking a slow, measured step toward him. "Let us talk about ownership. You assume you have equity in this estate because you have been sleeping in the master bedroom for the last 3 years. But you never bothered to actually read the closing documents when we purchased this property, did you? You just signed where my lawyers told you to sign, because you were too busy taking credit for the architectural design to care about the financial structure." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward Arthur Vance. "This Beacon Hill estate was not purchased under the name Marcus and Maya Jackson," I explained, spelling it out with agonizing clarity. "It was purchased in cash by an anonymous corporate entity called Apex Holdings, LLC. And as the sole managing director of Vanguard Holdings, I am the exclusive proprietor of Apex. Your name is not on the deed, Marcus. Your name is not on the property tax records. You do not own a single brick of this house. Under the law, you are nothing more than a temporary guest. And your invitation has just been permanently revoked." "But my clothes," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "My watches, my laptop, every single designer suit hanging in that closet was purchased using my personal credit cards." I countered, my gaze turning to absolute ice. "Every luxury watch in your display case was bought with my corporate dividends. Under the strict terms of the post-nuptial agreement, your mother forced me to sign those assets remain the sole property of the original purchaser. They belong to me." I paused, letting the devastating reality of his poverty sink in before delivering the final blow. "As for your laptop," I continued, leaning slightly closer to him, "did you honestly believe I would let you walk out of this house with the primary piece of digital evidence proving your federal wire fraud? That computer contains the unencrypted ledgers of your shell companies. It contains the padded user metrics you used to defraud the angel investors. That laptop is no longer your property, Marcus. It is currently locked in a Faraday bag in my home office, waiting to be handed directly over to the federal agents stationed at the bottom of the driveway." Marcus let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the solid chest of the security contractor. He was entirely trapped. His stolen wealth, his fake prestige, his entire carefully curated identity had been stripped away, leaving him with absolutely nothing. I turned my attention away from my ruined husband and swept my gaze across the rest of the grand foyer. The room was perfectly still. The catered waitstaff had vanished into the kitchen. The elite guests, the venture capitalists, the so-called friends who had spent the last 3 hours drinking my expensive champagne and laughing at Marcus' jokes were now pressing themselves against the walls, desperate to distance themselves from a massive federal crime scene. "The party is over," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Every single one of you needs to leave my property right now." Sierra, the mistress who had swaggered into my home, dripping in diamonds, bought with my stolen money, tried to slip quietly toward the side exit leading to the gardens. "Hold it right there, Sierra," I commanded, pointing sharply at her retreating figure. She froze, her shoulders stiffening. She slowly turned around, her beautiful face pale and terrified. The arrogant smirk she had worn all evening was completely gone. "You do not get to sneak out the back door, Sierra," I said, stepping toward her. "You wanted to be the woman on his arm. You wanted to parade around my house and claim the life I built, so you can walk out the front door with him. But before you go, you are going to take off that diamond tennis necklace." Sierra's eyes widened in shock. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching the glittering stones. "You cannot do that," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This was a gift. It was purchased with stolen venture capital." I corrected my tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "It is stolen property. Take it off right now, or I will have the security team hold you here until the federal marshals come inside to confiscate it as evidence." Sierra let out a humiliated sob. Her hands trembled violently as she fumbled with the clasp at the back of her neck. The heavy diamond necklace fell into her palms. She did not dare look me in the eye as she stepped forward and placed the glittering jewelry onto the marble entryway table. She backed away. Her head hung low, a thoroughly broken woman who had gambled on a fraud and lost everything. "Get out," I told her, pointing toward the massive oak doors. Sierra practically ran toward the exit, pulling the heavy doors open and slipping out into the cold night air. The harsh red and blue lights from the police cruisers waiting outside instantly washed over her, casting long, terrifying shadows across the marble floor. I turned my gaze to Jamal and Chloe. They were huddled together near the coat check, shivering despite the warmth of the house. "Your ride is gone, Jamal," I stated, looking at my spineless brother-in-law. "The marshals have already loaded your luxury SUV onto a flatbed tow truck. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your fraudulent marketing firm is currently being raided. You can walk back to whatever cheap motel will take a credit card that has not been declined yet." Chloe finally snapped. The sheer weight of her total social and financial annihilation broke through her shock. She dropped her designer clutch onto the floor and let out a blood-curdling shriek. "You cannot do this to us!" Chloe screamed, her face turning a mottled purple as she stomped her foot against the tile. "We are the Jacksons. We are respected in this city. You are destroying our reputation. Do you know who is out there? The neighbors are out there. The press is going to be out there. I cannot walk down that driveway in front of federal agents. I will be ruined. My friends will see. My entire life will be a joke. You should have thought about your reputation before you decided to fund your high society lifestyle with stolen money, Chloe." I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. "You are not a socialite. You are a common thief, and you are trespassing on my property." I nodded to the security contractors standing near the walls. Two massive guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Jamal by the arms and physically propelling him toward the open front doors. Chloe let out another hysterical wail as a third guard placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, guiding her forcefully behind her husband. "Do not touch me!" Chloe shrieked, swatting at the guard hand, her perfect blowout falling into a tangled mess around her face. "I am a lady. You are treating us like animals." She continued to scream and thrash as they pushed her out into the blinding glare of the police lights. The sound of her humiliated wailing echoed across the manicured lawn, entirely shattering the quiet dignity of the wealthy neighborhood. Pastor Thomas did not need to be told. The booming, confident religious leader looked like a ghost. He wrapped a trembling arm around Beatrice's waist, supporting her full weight as she continued to quietly sob into her hands. They did not look at Marcus. They did not look at me. They shuffled toward the door, heads bowed, completely destroyed by their own greed and hypocrisy. The remaining guests scrambled after them, abandoning their coats and fleeing out the front door, like rats scattering from a sudden light. No one wanted to be associated with Marcus Jackson. No one wanted their names tied to a federal fraud investigation. They abandoned him instantly, proving that their loyalty was only ever tied to his fake money. Within minutes, the grand foyer was completely empty, save for me, Arthur Vance, the security team, and Marcus. Marcus was still standing at the base of the stairs, staring out the open front doors. He could see the flashing lights. He could hear the crackle of the police radios. He knew exactly what was waiting for him at the bottom of the driveway. The realization of his absolute total ruin finally crushed the last remaining pillar of his fake reality. His knees buckled. Marcus collapsed onto the Italian tile, letting out a gut-wrenching, agonizing wail that tore through his throat. He curled into a tight fetal position on the floor, right where he had stood so arrogantly just an hour before. He buried his face in his arms, sobbing with the raw, unfiltered terror of a man who knew his life was entirely over. He had lost his company. He had lost his wealth. He had lost his family. He had lost his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left. I looked down at his trembling, pathetic form, feeling a profound wave of absolute cold peace wash over me. The garbage had finally been taken out. "Get him off my floor," I commanded, turning my back on him. The massive security contractor reached down, grabbing Marcus roughly by the back of his expensive suit jacket. Marcus shrieked in panic, his arms flailing wildly as the guard hoisted him to his feet and dragged him kicking and sobbing toward the open doors and the flashing lights of the federal agents waiting in the dark. The security guard hauled Marcus across the threshold, his Italian leather shoes scuffed against the stone steps as he was unceremoniously deposited onto the manicured front lawn. The cold night air hit him, but did nothing to sober his hysterics. Around him, the rest of the Jackson family was already experiencing the harsh reality of their public downfall. Federal agents and local police had established a hard perimeter, pushing the crying and arguing family members toward the street. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Doors of neighboring multi-million-dollar estates were opening. Wealthy residents wrapped in cashmere coats stood on their pristine porches holding glasses of wine as they watched the mighty Jacksons being treated like common trespassers. I stepped out onto my front portico, standing between the massive stone columns, and looked down at the spectacle. The same people Beatrice had spent years trying to impress the very high society circle she had used to belittle my worth were now witnessing her absolute ruin. A loud mechanical grinding sound pierced through the wailing. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was backing up the curved driveway. The bright yellow lettering on the side clearly identified it as a bank asset recovery vehicle. Marcus stopped sobbing just long enough to realize what was happening. The repossession crew was hooking thick steel chains to the front axle of his custom-ordered sports car. The vehicle he had proudly paraded around town, the symbol of his fake tech empire, was being dragged away to satisfy a fraction of his massive corporate debt. "Wait!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged toward the tow truck. "You cannot take that. My files are in there." A federal marshal immediately intercepted him, shoving him firmly back onto the wet grass. The agent curtly informed him that the vehicle and everything inside it was now federal property, subject to seizure. Marcus crumpled to the ground, clutching his head as the winch whined loudly, hoisting the expensive car onto the flatbed. I walked to the edge of the portico, looking down at the scattered remnants of my former family. Pastor Thomas was guiding Beatrice down the sidewalk, their heads bowed low, avoiding the staring eyes of the neighborhood. Jamal and Chloe were arguing fiercely with a police officer who was pointing them toward the street intersection, demanding they clear the property line. None of them dared to look back at the house. None of them dared to look up at me. The sheer, crushing weight of their humiliation kept their eyes glued to the pavement. They scuttled away from the home they had once tried to claim, completely stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their power. The flashing police lights cast long, moving shadows across the lawn as the tow truck finally rumbled down the street, hauling away the last piece of Marcus' fake legacy. I stood silently on the top step of the porch, letting the cold wind wash over my face. I watched their retreating figures grow smaller and smaller until they completely disappeared into the unforgiving darkness of the night. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thud, abruptly cutting off the chaotic symphony of police sirens and Marcus' fading screams. The sudden silence that settled over the grand foyer was absolute and profoundly beautiful. The suffocating energy that the Jackson family had carried into my home was completely gone, washed away by the cold reality of their own consequences. I turned away from the entryway, the sharp click of my heels echoing clearly through the empty space as I walked slowly back into the living room. The remnants of their lavish celebration lay abandoned on the tables, half-empty champagne flutes and untouched hors d'oeuvres, but I ignored them all. I moved straight toward the plush velvet sofa and picked up the crystal glass of red wine I had poured what felt like a lifetime ago. Arthur Vance stood near the fireplace, snapping the latches of his titanium briefcase shut. He looked up at me, the faint ghost of a professional smile playing at the corners of his usually stoic mouth. "A highly efficient cleanse, Madam Chief Executive," he observed, his voice quiet and respectful. "The structural integrity of Vanguard Holdings remains completely uncompromised. The authorities will have their hands full with the Jacksons for the next decade." I nodded, raising the wine glass slightly in his direction. "It was a flawless execution, Arthur. Thank you." He offered a crisp bow and quietly exited through the side door, leaving me entirely alone in the center of my meticulously reclaimed sanctuary. I stood in the middle of the room taking a slow, deep breath. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Life is not a fairy tale where a woman sits quietly and waits for a prince to rescue her from a tower of abuse. Sometimes you have to forge your own sword and burn the tower down yourself. I let my gaze sweep across the elegant room, savoring the totality of my victory. The traitors had been completely eradicated. Marcus, the man who had confidently plotted my financial ruin, was now sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle stripped of his company, his wealth, and his freedom. Chloe, the arrogant supremacist, who had weaponized her fake high society status to mock my worth, was locked out of her mansion, crying on a suburban curb with nothing but the clothes on her back. Pastor Thomas and Beatrice, the hypocritical architects of this toxic family dynamic, were facing the complete collapse of their religious empire and the cold, terrifying reality of federal prison. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sweeping view of the estate I had secured entirely on my own. The flashing police lights had finally disappeared down the street, leaving only the quiet, steady glow of the moon illuminating the manicured lawn. Just 1 hour ago, Marcus stood in this very room and called me a burden. He looked at me and saw someone small, someone manageable, someone he could easily discard and destroy. He was so fundamentally wrong. Now I am his largest creditor. I am the sole proprietor of his massive debt. I am the one who holds absolute dominion over his fate. I brought the crystal glass to my lips, the dark red wine catching the ambient light of the room. Never back a woman into a corner because you have no idea what empire she has built in the dark. I took a slow, satisfying sip. The taste was absolute perfection.